blimey. Yeah, it's an absolute honour to speak at FFConf. It's one of my favourites. Seeing everyone's lovely faces and following Leone is super high pressure. Hopefully my talk won't be utter bollocks, but we'll see how it goes. And sorry to the stenographer, Amanda. I know it's late and I've got a Yorkshire accent, but there we go. Right, should we get cracking then? So, do you want to get better at CSS? That's a good answer. Yeah. How do you go about it though? Do you read the specs? Do you do tutorials, coding challenges, building websites? All of those things are very good things to do, but let me throw a curveball into the mix for you. The path to becoming a truly great CSS developer or a general front-end developer is down to more than coding. It comes down to how you approach everything else, like planning, communication, giving and receiving feedback, and finding a pragmatic solution. I've been working with CSS for over 15 years at this point, and a lot has changed in its capabilities. What hasn't changed though is in that time, the core skills, often described as soft skills, that are required to push you to that next level of being a good developer. I've spent a large chunk of those 15 years as a consultant helping organizations, both global corporations and small startups, write better CSS. Horrendous job. In almost every single case though, an improvement to those organizations' core skills with a definitive difference in the quality of output at the end. So back in the bad old days of web design, the early 2010s, we had a pretty bad habit of designers designing pictures of websites in Photoshop and then handing them off to an enthusiastic front-end developer who would try to recreate that picture of a website exactly, and then they would valiantly try to get every pixel perfect, make sure every little line was in line with each other, and then hand it back to the designer, who would then send a snag list about 3.5 pages long. And like even during this period of time where we could make a reasonable assumption about the user's browser and the viewport, pixel perfection still wasn't the ideal way of designing websites even then. And there's a hangover from print design where everything is finalized in design tools. And then almost all of the time, unless you prepare those print assets incorrectly, which I've done many times, the prints would come back looking exactly how you designed them in InDesign or whatever. But frustratingly, design tools have progressed a lot, but that tired old way of flinging a web design over the fence has stuck around like poop on your shoe. And it's stuck and it will stick around for years to come, especially as tools like Figma actively encourage handoff with dev mode. CSS is also moving super fast, which is great. But what isn't great is that people are starting to feel behind because they don't know container queries or has, or the fact that you can vertically center elements in a block element now. Yep, pretty cool, eh? And they feel like they have to stuff their existing skill set with these new features as a priority. And I know it's anecdotal of my experience, but I see almost no material on how that new stuff can help people who, building websites. We instead see a lot of demoware content and, ooh, this is a cool abstract thing to do. Yep. Unfortunately, thanks to the algorithmic nature of Twitter, RIP, join Blue Sky, and YouTube, we get lots of content that invokes a reaction. The type, like a YouTube thumbnail looks a bit like that knobhead. And where they say, media queries are dead, long live container queries. And I get it, like that content sells, but I do worry about the impact that that's having on people who are trying to stuff their skill set with this new syntax. And they're putting aside those core skills because they feel like they're behind and they feel like they're not doing it right because of this sort of content. We're also pretty bad at communicating. It's not all of our fault though. tools are geared towards us not communicating and instead just executing, I'll turn my attention back to Figma's dev mode capability here. Instead of tackling that problem that, pixel perfection's not the best way to design for the web, all dev mode's done is just make pixel perfection more efficient for developers. Communication isn't really helped by the nature of the business we work in now either. There's a lot of KPI chasing and a rush to deliver new features, which naturally overworks people and burns them out. And the last thing folks want with this increased workload is to be attending even more meetings, right? So to combat this, a wealth of tools are deployed to distill features into deliverables and not the impact of those features. I mean, all you have to do is think how many products have shoehorned AI into the system with a clear disregard for how that probably isn't actually very helpful for people. It's not all doom and gloom though. I'm not going to stand here for half an hour and rant. I'm just setting the stage for us. It's really healthy to look at the industry and say what you see. And don't be downbeat either. Like, I'm going to show you how to work in this antiquated system more efficiently. Design handoff and a focus on tools is not going anywhere anytime soon, so we might as well learn to excel in the bounds of that system. And if it all does go away, which I hope, then there's loads of transferable skills that you can learn in this little session. Okay, so I hope after this session, you won't be the same as you were before I opened my gob. I'll be delighted if in the future you can look back and say, do you know what, Andy's talk triggered some genuine positive changes around here. I hope, anyway. Even if only, yeah, don't tell me otherwise. Even if only one tiny thing changes today, I've done my job and I can sleep easy. Let's get stuck in. I'll get the standard speaker line in as well. I haven't got much time. So I'm not going to crunch hundreds of slides down your throat and talk about all the latest and greatest CSS features. In fact, I think I only say CSS in this talk about 5 times. So it's not my usual sort of deal. But I want to really focus on the things I think are actually really important. And one principle we absolutely need to get right is communication. So let's start with that. So asynchronous communication is critical. In fact, it's critical even if you work in the same time zone, same office as each other, because we spend a lot of our time on screens in tools like Slack or Teams if you're nasty. And in the design studio I run, Set Studio, we're a team of 4. And we're all based in the UK. And our primary mode of communication is Slack. Async communication is critical even for us because we're all in the same time zone. I mean, a couple of us even live in the same town as each other, but we all work completely different schedules to each other with no real sort of set hours. We also work with clients all over the world. So for example, there was a period where we had clients in India, the UK, and the USA running at the same time with stakeholders based in the UK and Panama with a freelance developer based in Hong Kong. So it was a pretty spread out time zone spread. So getting the written communication right in that context is really important. So here's a little listicle of principles I like to follow. Keep things short. There's absolutely no need for filler content, so just get to the point. Like, try not to recreate in-person preamble and pleasantries in text-based communication. Sure, ask how people are, but just get to the point. And don't ask for too much either. If you ask multiple questions or ask for multiple pieces of information, it's likely you won't get the answers that you want. If you want to know multiple things, just create a nice thread or a list. And unless it's an emergency, let your colleague know that there's no rush to get back to you with the answers and to come back to you when they do have all of those answers instead. This is a really important one. Presume people are busy. This is especially the case when dealing with stakeholders and people in positions of management. Like, they're spinning a lot of plates a lot of the time. And what you want to know is often beyond their daily responsibilities too, especially in the case of stakeholders if you work in client services like I do. And if a request is blocking you, you're probably asking too late. Effective planning and scheduling of your workflow will surface things you need to know well before the block you. So try and be proactive and get ahead of things. This is probably the most important one. Absolutely never make it personal. Like, if you make it personal, you're going to upset people and get the backs up. It's unnecessary and breaks down relationships. And there's absolutely never a need to be an arsehole. And then be descriptive and don't presume prior knowledge. I can tell you from working with some of the smallest and largest corporations in the world that folks' knowledge of stuff is spotty at best. Don't presume people have the time and the same level of knowledge as you do too on specific elements of the work, because they probably don't. So like I say, we use Slack internally, and I know a lot of you use other tools, but these principles are universal regardless of what you use. So don't be a high guy. Let's just break down what's wrong here. Like, firstly, we're presuming that this designer is both online and staring at the messages, which is almost certainly not the case. And just saying, like, sending hi to someone can be a source of anxiety too, because they might think, oh man, am I in trouble? Or, have I pissed someone off? And you're going to distract them with this approach too, because they're going to be sitting there and waiting for you to carry on writing. So here's a better way. Now, what I'm going to do when you see these chat windows is I'm going to read them out, because it'd be really, really awkward if I just stood here in silence and waited for you all to read them. It just makes things a little bit more inclusive as well. So I've started a chat window here and I'm saying, hey, hope you're good. I've picked up a couple of bits on the design, which looks really great, by the way. I'll create a thread here so we can chat it out as and when you get time. And the designer responds with, awesome, that sounds great. I've got some free time later, so I'll check in then. So the difference here is huge. First of all, we're being descriptive and we're not asking too much. We're also presuming that the designer is busy. So that's 3 principles checked off. Oh, we kept it short, so that's 4. We're also keeping the tone neutral and not personal. And finally, we're working in advance of when we need the information, therefore checking off all 6 principles. The main thing though is the designer knows that you're going to thread out your notes and you're not expecting an immediate response. This means they'll probably add a quick to-do to their list and then get back to you when they've got the answers. And importantly, they can carry on with the work that they were focused on. There are times though when you do need a quick response, when there is emergencies. So I get that, but there's a way to do it wrong and to do it right. So I open a chat here and I say, I need you to fix the colors on this design immediately because of accessibility. The client is pissed off. And the designer responds with, wait, what do you mean by because of accessibility? What did the client say? And this is the point. So all we're doing here is we're panicking them. Like, even if you're extremely stressed, which I can test I often am, you should never project that onto another person. You can get urgency from people without doing all that too. So let me show you how I do it. So I open a chat and I say, hey, I've just been speaking to the client and they've picked up some color contrast issues with the latest round of designs, specifically on the smaller text. The colors don't conform to WCAG AA. Just a little aside here. Notice how I'm always putting links to stuff because I'm not presuming prior knowledge, and that's a requirement of the project. It'd be really helpful if you can make some adjustments quite urgently because the client is rather concerned. I'm here to support you if you need help with testing, etc. Sorry to break you off from what you're doing. And the designer responds with, my bad, I'll get on that ASAP. Thanks for the link too, that's really helpful. Do you have any recommendations of tools I can use in Figma to test compliance? Sure thing. I found Stark to be really useful, all around, great accessibility tool. And the designer thanks us, and the job's a good one. And see how much more productive that is. We're not attacking the designer, but instead we're being descriptive. We're not asking for too much, and we're offering help and support. And this then becomes less, you have done this wrong, and more, there's an issue, and I'm here to support you to fix it. In that prior example, the designer could have easily and understandably felt attacked. Whereas here we're communicating the urgency, but we're making it rightly a team issue. Sure, it's the designer that's going to need to fix the colors, but they know that they've got the support behind them and the testing support to make sure they do it right. And that's the most important thing. All right, so let's talk about my favorite communication method and everyone else's least favorite. Aside from the relentless amount of emails we get on a daily basis, there's a real problem with email that I find, in the sense that people fill them with absolute cruft. So let's take this same conversation context about color contrast and put it into our favorite medium, email. So I've written an email to the designer here, and I'm saying, "Hi designer, hope this email finds you well. I hope you had a fantastic weekend. Did you get up to much? The family and I went to the beach and had a great relaxing time. For the project, the client has raised concerns about color contrast and accessibility. You can read the email thread below. Best regards, Andy Bell, front-end developer, made-up company. We are a carbon-conscious company, so please don't print this email." Just notice all the cruft in there. Like, sure, it's nice to talk about weekends, but not in an important email like this. In fact, we talk more about weekends than what the actual problem is, which is barely covered. I've just put them down into a thread instead. It's just so lazy. Like, remember, people's inboxes are generally rammed full of emails, so be a good colleague and make yours concise and effective. So this is how I do it in the real world. So I've started a new email and I said, "Hey, I've just been speaking to the client and they've picked up some color contrast issues with the latest round of designs, specifically on the smaller text. The colors don't conform to WCAG AA, which is a requirement for this project. It'd be really helpful if you can make some adjustments quite urgently because the client is rather concerned. I'm here to support you if you need help with testing, etc. Sorry to break you off from what you're doing. You're not having a deja vu." That was exactly the same as the better Slack example from earlier. And that's the point I'm trying to make. Just because it's an email doesn't mean you need to fill it with useless shit. Like, treat emails much like messages, especially internal email, and you'll do a lot for reducing people's overwhelm. Another important point here is you're actually more likely to get a response from the designer because you've covered all the points that you need to address in that short email. So they're probably going to not just mark it unread and ignore it, which is what they'd probably do before. All right, so this is the bit I promised Remy. This is me fulfilling my brief, mate. But this is also really important, and this is why we had that conversation with each other, because it's something I've been obsessed with for a while. Rue's clearly obsessed with it too. So let's talk about feedback. Contentious often, but it shouldn't be ever. So as we covered earlier in the session, core skills like communication are critical in writing better HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But you might be thinking, like, how the hell does that even happen? So allow me to change your perspective. By nailing communication, you will, by proxy, simplify and sanitize design work. And this results in simpler code, which is what we should always be aiming for. Simpler code is easier to maintain and harder to break. It's more likely it'll handle a plethora of conditions that can break it too, such as overloaded content, dodgy browser connections, oddly configured and clashing browser extensions, and of course, the heap of shit that is accessibility overlays. What we want to be avoiding is writing code that when you come back to it in the future, you'll ask, what the hell is going on here? It's communication, review, quality of feedback, and planning that'll get you to that almost utopian point. Utopia, by the way, you should use it. Dealing with and giving feedback well is super important. So let's dig into that specifically for a moment. Please admire my web design skills. Related to our principles of not presuming knowledge, when providing feedback to a designer or a stakeholder like a project manager, you need to explain in detail what the issue is. Let's have a look at this fantastic example here. There's a hero unit at the top of the page, and it's got one of those auto-playing slider/carousels on it. In the real world, you might not think it, but these are extremely common still, and are often implemented to squeeze as much content as possible onto the homepage above the fold. It's a tired design pattern, but feeding that back is not going to cut it. So I've opened up my little Slack, and I said, we shouldn't use a slider on the homepage because it's such a tired old design pattern. To which the designer either responds with, it's what the client wants, it's what they've signed off, so there's not much I can do. And that got us absolutely nowhere. All we've achieved is getting the designers back up. Any chance of making any positive adjustments to this design are likely gone forever. And we, friends, are building a user experience overwhelm and potential accessibility nightmare. Sure, you can keep prodding like this, but it won't change anything. So here's how I'd approach it instead. So I open a little chat up and say, hey, the designs are looking really great, which they are. There's one section that I'm quite concerned about and would like to understand the decision more. With the homepage hero slider, I've got concerns about potential accessibility problems, overwhelm, and user experience. There's not an echo in here, I promise. This is a useful quick read on the subject to give you more context about my concerns. So the designer gives a bit more context behind it. So they say, I've got you. To give you the context, this section was a nightmare to get over the line because different stakeholders all thought their departments were equally as important as each other. And I respond with, I get that and really feel for you having to navigate that situation. Considering their departments are so important, they've not produced much content for them, have they? To which the designer responds, not at all. I'm going to have to produce a background for each one too, which isn't ideal. And then I address that problem with, well, we might not achieve the right levels of color contrast with the text on each slide, especially as this is CMS content. It might be right when we hand it over, but that could change really quick. The perks of client services. Maybe we should get some data to support our concerns. It'll be worth looking at what the average session time is on their current homepage, because we're going to have to wait at least a few seconds before the next slide changes, right? We could argue a user will likely never get beyond the first slide. The designer responds, if that's a good shout. The problem is they still want an impactful hero, in quotes, and to promote each department equally. I'll get some data for us to look at, and I'll have a think about other design ideas too in the interim. So what a designer doesn't need at this point is hostility, but instead ammunition to go back with. Developers are in a really strong position to provide that ammunition because we're all clearly unwell and obsessed with this stuff. And they've usually got a broader understanding of all the problems that can happen. Remember, you're a team unit, not competing individuals. So let's imagine for a second, in the 10 seconds I've just been talking, our designers come back and given us a new design, and we've also built it miraculously. They've come back with a new pattern. It's got hero now with a nice big title, and it's got a 4-column grid. And in each column, we've got a title, subtitle, and summary, which is some of the greatest micro copy I've ever written. Thank you very much. So on the smaller screens, we've got this overflow display pattern, and the idea is that then that indicates to the user that there's more content. We've gone ahead and built it, and it's looking great. And the first item, because of this overflow pattern, needs to change for each page load, but we've missed that bit out. So rightly, the designer's got in our DMs and they've said, hey, the new homepage section looks really great, but the first grid item is the same on each page when I look at it, even after refreshes. The client really wanted those to change on each page load. And I come back with, I can't do that because they'll all shift around. Large manipulations of the DOM aren't good either. And it's straight up useless response. What is the designer expected to do with that feedback? In these situations, it's about landing on a solution that pleases everybody. So try this for a size instead. So the designer sent the same feedback, and I've responded with thanks. Yet I struggled to get this working well because I'd have to rearrange the content with client-side JavaScript. The problem with that is there's a good chance JavaScript will fail, big emphasis on will, and or not be available. That's why I got the overflow scrolling setup working with CSS only. If JavaScript does work, big emphasis on if, manipulating the DOM like that can be quite clunky, especially on low-powered devices. So the designer comes back with, got it. The reason they wanted that to randomize is similar to why they wanted the slider in the first place. They're adamant that each department is as important as each other, and they don't want one department being prioritized over the other. It's really frustrating because they won't move on that. Not the truth. So I respond with, sounds very frustrating to me. The content comes from a CMS, but the site is built with a static site generator, providing the link and not presuming knowledge. This means it's built once and a static HTML page is served to the user. What if they change the order of the content in the CMS quite regularly, which would trigger a rebuild of the static site? To which the designer responds, it's a good idea, but I know they won't want to do that. They're really quite lazy as well as demanding. Ugh, it's like a trauma, this, for me. All right. So, okay, how about this? We set the site to rebuild every hour with automation, and when it does rebuild, it randomizes the order of the content each time. The designer responds with, "Now that's a good idea. I thought so too." No client legwork required, and they get what they want in essence. Let me run it past them and see how much more productive that is. Not only have we avoided implementing a slider in the hero, we've also avoided writing some nasty ass JavaScript that will almost certainly fail too. And this is the trick with feedback. Use it to make things better together. I know each project has different tech stacks and challenges. You don't want to see what I've seen over the last 15 years of client services work. But the point I'm making is that collaborating rather than battling will likely get you a happy medium that's importantly simple. Trust me, designers want the best for users as much as you do, so help them to actually achieve that rather than being a prick. So let's move on to the sort of last section. And this is something that I actually think is the most important thing you can do to become a better developer. And I imagine you read that slide and thought it doesn't even make sense, mate. And it technically doesn't, but I want to cover what I think is just so important. So time management people on LinkedIn will tell you to create complex project management solutions with statuses and velocity tracking. But all this stuff does is abstract away what's actually important in design systems and building websites and apps for people. And that's giving a shit about them and not creating yourselves a long-term maintenance nightmare. It's tempting when deep in the woods of a project to de-scope to save time and or budget. And yeah, that gets suggested a lot in my line of work running an agency. But all of this is to go faster and get to the finish line. And the compromises made to go faster are often unseen and more horrific than you could ever imagine until later down the line. For example, speaking of AI bollocks, there is chasing the pack, not getting left behind, as it were. And my mind immediately goes to so-called AI. And I'm thinking down the line of very large corporations like Google chasing AI down like I imagine a dog chases a butcher's van down the road if there was a string of sausages hanging out the back. The desperation not to be left behind results in not only humorous missteps with Google's AI summaries on search, but also potentially damaging outcomes, such as users being told to add glue to pizza sauce so the cheese doesn't fall off. The point I'm making is that sprinting towards a goal, be it profit, deadlines, or any other outcome, is moving fast without proper planning, research, and analysis is more likely to result in harm rather than help. So let me tell you a story, everybody. Gather around and give me a moment to share one of my personal failures in this industry of ours. It's not the one where I had to culp 100,000 brochures from a spelling mistake. It's a different one. We go back to 2019, when as a freelancer, I assisted on a design system build for a large, well-known cruise travel agent. Aside from the frequent giggles at regular cruise travelers describing themselves as cruisers, it was a resoundingly horrifying project. Instead of the usual steps of research, discovery, analysis, and thorough planning before the development process, we, thanks to a very tight and hard deadline, just dove straight first into building the damn thing. The damn thing had solely been designed in Sketch by super talented designers, really good people, but they had like a really quite limited knowledge of the web and tech in general. And unfortunately, that resulted in lots of inconsistencies that would be exposed with a design system. And one of those inconsistencies was multiple layout systems, depending on which designer was working on it at the time. Not to mention there were various conflicts in technology choices that were never truly ironed out, so developers just went rogue with their own ideas. Never fun. And I could and should have thrown down the anchor on the build, keeping the sailing analogies there. But I didn't. I went full steam ahead instead. And in my mind, we get it done and we survey the damage after the fact. And the damage was extensive. We had not one, nor two, but 3 grid systems. We had components that were so fragile that they would blow up at the mere hint of stress. and so many technical inconsistencies and lack of technical documentation that it would be a miracle if a developer could pick it up and maintain it. Why am I even telling you this? I want you to learn from my mistakes. The reason I'm talking about all this because I have experienced a lot of bad working in this industry. And a lot of that bad was entirely avoidable by just taking one step back, slowing the process down, and making better decisions with a clearer mind. And as the old saying goes, slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. Hey Andy, you barely talked about CSS. And that is by design. I've done so many talks over the years about very specific CSS things, but for once I want to talk about things that I actually think are really important. CSS is also really important in writing scalable and maintainable front ends, but what's more important as I see it is getting those core skills right and then building from them. It's why the talk is called Get the Core Right and the Resilient Code Will Follow. I couldn't in good faith stand up here and tell you how to write CSS specifically for your organizations because every single company has a different setup and different goals. I need more time to be able to deliver more detailed content in a consultancy context. Wink, wink. You might think, well, I'm working in an industry standard way, but sorry, you're not, because there's no such thing. Sure, you might be working with web standards, you better be, but there is no industry standard way because, again, every single company has a different setup and different goals. But if you really focus on improving your communication, improving your feedback loops, and invest more time up front to planning, prototyping, testing, and research, your code bases will be smaller, simpler, and easier to maintain. Don't get hung up on the tools over dissecting every piece of a project too. Sure, there's time after getting the core right to spend time working out which framework you want to use or whatever else gets you off. The point I'm making is the core, planning, prototyping, testing, and research should be the priority. It's all about iteration too. So for example, when you've decided what framework you want to use, you better damn make sure you rinse and repeat the planning process to make sure you cover every single base. Do some thorough prototyping because you want to uncover problems with the framework when it does screw you over, which they all do. You want to do that in the prototyping phase rather than when you're in the last week of a deadline project. You can still change your minds at the start. Hope you found this session useful. It's all content from my course, Complete CSS, which comes out later this month. I hope you'll pop over and have a look at what it's all about. I do actually cover a lot of CSS stuff in there, I promise. That's me done for today, so thanks for your time. I'm Andy Bell, and I'd love to speak to you all more later. Thank you.